let me get your thoughts on something. 3 or 4 years ago, cults were in the news a lot. 20 years ago and more, it seemed like they were in the headlines almost every day. Remember Charlie Manson and his Helter Skelter? Reverend Moon's intimate Korean wedding for 1800? Jim Jones' Kool-Aid event that reminded us that none of this was funny. 900 people died in a place far from home that Jones had dragged them to. Are these kinds of guys still lurking out there someplace? Or has their day passed?
Well, two fairly current names pop to mind. Warren Jeffs and Bill Gothard, both still relevant. Jeffs was, until his incarceration a few years ago, head of the cult of fundamentalist Latter-day Saints in Arizona. He's now been retired from the FBI's most wanted list, but his group is unquestionably ongoing and is a cult tended to by Jeff's son. Bill Gothard, the evangelical Christian guru you and I have talked about often in the past, may or may not be a cult leader. The water's a little muddier there.
Actually, I think we have no idea how many of these strange fringe groups are still out there. I've read numbers in the thousands, but of course nobody can know for certain.
And if you can forget that people are getting hurt, some are pretty funny.
Yeah.
Like Reverend Donald Barnett's Church of Agape in Seattle, where members were enjoined, no pun intended, constantly to make spiritual connections that were anything but spiritual.
I know Gothard is still going strong, but as I see it, he's of a totally different ilk.
Actually, I see him as exactly the same, but in a different way.
Oh, yeah? All right, tell me how you see it. What makes a fringe group a cult? Let's try to find a definition and see how these guys fit into it.
Well then, I believe to be considered a cult, a group must meet certain requirements, which some groups will just naturally fall into and need no credential check. Charlie Manson, Jim Jones, David Koresh. Think of their examples as we go through the elements. But don't forget Jeffs, Gothard, and Barnett, who may not be as well known, but their cancer is just as malignant. First, I believe a cult is a group where the leader substitutes his wisdom for that of his chosen deity. Donald Barnett, for instance, told his flock their Bible was just plain wrong, so follow his lead.
The leader will usually tell people that his words are the words of God.
Well, of course, and that's how he becomes a son of God. This is what Dr. Moon did. Next, he segregates and isolates his flock from the outside world, meaning that the cultish behavior becomes more extreme with time. Isolation and segregation are absolutely essential. They cannot thrive in the open air. A David Koresh or Charles Manson figure is someone that most people would never follow in a billion years, because there's something off about him. He's very charismatic, but scary, and his eyes bore through you. You want to run and you want to follow him, but you don't understand why. An untold number followed God's son, Mr. Moon. Only about 13 or so followed Manson, but they wreaked the havoc of 100 more.
On the other hand, Bill Gothard is an advocate of social mixing. He doesn't even found his own churches. So how is he a cult leader?
Though Gothard may take a socially unisolated group, he does manage to isolate them very neatly. I recall, for instance, that when you went to teach at a Gothard Writers' Conference, you were instructed not to talk about fiction.
And they knew I was a novelist.
Is this not isolation?
Yeah, it is.
We're told their children are not permitted to date, and their marriages are arranged. In short, Gothard micromanages the lives of every one of his flock. Neither argument nor questioning are allowed. In a true cult, the leader decides who dates, marries, sleeps with, has a child with, lives with. No decision may be made by anyone but the leader or his lieutenants. It's very important that the capacity for independent thought be interrupted and or destroyed, so that every member of the flock literally becomes a sheep and absolutely compliant. The man in control makes the rules. He decides who's we and who's they.
That's correct. And as we're learning, there are many different ways of isolating people. Physical, where people are moved into some remote prison camp kind of atmosphere.
A la Manson.
Or something as simple as a highly restrictive form of homeschooling that's done more for the purpose of isolating the child than educating him.
And then finally, beyond isolation, usually there's a sexual component to cult behavior that kicks in somewhere along the way, wherein God has given the leader special permission either to have sex with or to marry whomever he wants. And like isolation, the sexual component is apt to begin relatively simply. Nothing too scary until the mark is in too far to pull back.
It's wholly different in the Gothard movement. Bill Gothard has never been married, and he claims to have what he calls the gift of celibacy. But he poses as a great authority on how marriages and parenting should be handled. In his chain of command dynamic, everything has to come through the family in the proper order. God makes the decisions and passes them on to the father, who passes them on to the wife and kids. Only when a woman marries is she freed from her parents' control. Then her husband becomes her umbrella head, as Gothard calls it. On the other hand, when Gothard told thousands of men across the country in his seminars that God had appointed them to be the absolute heads of their households, unfortunately, an incredible number of them took his instructions as license to rule their wives and children like despots. And so perhaps the most tragic result of Gothard's rigid teaching has been a massive harvest of marriages and homes gone awry.
And yet another tragedy is that cultic children are given as little education as the cult leader's arrogance will permit them to get away with. Girls are bred to be breeders and do not need an education. The older men are happy to educate the useful parts. And young boys who begin displaying hormonal development become rivals to the older men and are kicked out. 12 and 13-year-old boys out on the streets expected to fend for themselves in a world they have no idea how to deal with and which they have already been taught to fear.
That's tragic indeed. Now, as far as Gothard is concerned, mostly we might agree that he never started out to be a cult leader. But you know, lots of people are asking, has he crossed the line? What do you think?
Well, I think that if we limit ourselves to the definitions that we've created here, while he doesn't fit in neatly, Gothard does fit into the cult mold rather handily.
Well, I think it's too close to call. Whatever cultish aspects may be there developed gradually. I don't know. I'm sure, however, that Gothard was never a Jim Jones or a Donald Barnett.
But not many were, thank God. Can he be considered a cult leader? That's the question.
Watch me neatly sidestep the issue while fully answering the core question. Stories like Barnett's and Gothard's serve as a warning that cults can spring up in the very pews where we feel most secure. There are so many sects and groups that crowd the borderlines. Some will find their way to a settled existence and stability, while others will grow more and more cultish until there will be no question as to what they are.
Rita Rudner, the stand-up comedian, said it best for me. I wonder if other dogs think poodles are members of a weird religious cult.